Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Anti-Heroes, Sun Tzu's Art of War. There's a brutal but memorable anecdote about Sun Tzu, alleged author of the treatise usually called The Art of War in English. An anecdote so notorious that we may as well begin with it, though you have perhaps heard it before. The story goes that the king of a state called Wu was looking for a new military strategist. Sun Tzu offered to show what he could do by training the women of the palace to march in formation, like soldiers. He put the king's two favorite concubines in charge of directing the rest of the women. But once he had carefully explained what they were to do, all the women just laughed at the incongruous situation. Sun Tzu called for the two concubines to be beheaded, on the grounds that clear instructions had been given, and that as commanders, these two had failed to see that the instructions were carried out. He then once again told the women to march in formation as they'd been told, and this time they carried out the commands to the letter. The anecdote concludes with Sun Tzu telling the king, "The army is well ordered, however you might want to employ them, even sending them forth into fire and water will not present any difficulty. They can be used to settle all under heaven." Which, you have to say, doesn't sound very Daoist. Even if we discount the anecdote as mere legend, it seems to represent Sun Tzu as a man of casual violence, far removed from the gentle sage presented in the Lao Tzu. Yet it's often noted that the Art of War shares many similar themes with the Lao Tzu, to the point that one scholar even refers to its advice on military affairs as applied Daoism. To see why, we'll first need to understand how there came to be men like Sun Tzu, high-ranking military advisors who were men of thought as well as men of action. They developed coherent theories of effective practice in warfare, theories of such abstractness and depth as to bear comparison to the ideas of contemporaneous philosophers. While The Art of War is by far the most famous such text, there are others, for instance a work by Sun Bin, who was supposedly a direct descendant of Sun Tzu, perhaps his grandson, and the Wuzi Bingfa, which adopts views closer to those of the Confucians. In all, there are 7 texts from ancient China that would later be considered classics of military strategy. Nor does this exhaust the classical literature on the subject. A historian we've often mentioned, Sima Qian, also wrote about warfare, and his ideas are preserved in the Shiji, or Records of the Grand Historian. Figures like Sun Tzu, whom we might call military intellectuals, emerged in response to historical circumstances. During the Zhou dynasty and the Spring and Autumn period, military conflict was an activity for aristocrats. As Mark Edward Lewis has explained in a book about violence in ancient China, this ruling class was bound together by acts of killing. They hunted together, sacrificed together, and exchanged ritual gifts of meat. Basing himself on the historical chronicle called the Zhou Zhuan, Lewis reports that there were 540 interstate wars and 130 civil wars in the Spring and Autumn period. As he says, years without combat would have been so infrequent that they would scarcely have been noticed. Of course, things didn't get less violent in the subsequent Age of the Warring States, otherwise we'd call it the Age of the States who got along surprisingly well. But there was a significant shift, away from highly skilled combat using chariots to battles involving mass infantry. Armies grew enormously in size, and to provide the needed soldiers, the whole male population was subject to conscription. The army was no longer the elite, but just the whole people, by another name. And no longer were the political rulers the commanders of the army. Now that job would be done by a specialist, someone like Sun Tzu, with the skills needed to organize forces of this size. This simultaneously solved another dilemma, which we might call the dirty hands problem. Of course, kings had never been averse to engaging in violence. The classical honor culture was built around it. But winning wars often means being at least a little dishonorable. As the Confucians were relentlessly pointing out, the successful ruler must be benevolent, honest, and forthright, which seems inconsistent with, say, setting ambushes or leading enemy forces into a trap. Lewis argues that such morally compromising tactics were effectively outsourced to the military intellectuals. Their independent command meant that they could do whatever was necessary without the lord getting his hands dirty. In fact, this is illustrated by the story of Sun Tzu and the concubines. When he announces that the two women will be executed, the king protests, but Sun Tzu responds that the decision is not up to him, as this is a question of military discipline. In this sphere, the commander's judgment is supreme. The same point is made in The Art of War, which tells us that victorious generals are the ones who are free from interference by their superiors. Of course, we might reject the notion that a king can remain innocent of ethically dubious actions by delegating them to someone else, in which case we'd be agreeing with Confucians like Sun Tzu. One chapter of the work that bears his name is dedicated to questions of military conduct and shows the morally rigorous Sun Tzu in discussion with a more pragmatic or perhaps cynical interlocutor named Lin Wu. His attitudes are quite reminiscent of what we find in Sun Tzu, who is even named as an inspiration at one point for Lin Wu's claim that the commander should exploit whatever circumstances arise so as to sow confusion amongst his enemies. Sun Tzu disagrees. For him, the good leader is one who displays benevolence, Waran, and such a man cannot be defeated with mere trickery. Underhanded tactics might work against others who are bent on deception, but the benevolent ruler is not so easy to fool. Using ritual propriety as his guide, he unifies the people behind him, which makes him invincible. To defeat such a man, says Sun Tzu, is like trying to chop down a mountain with a knife. Furthermore, as we already saw when we were talking about the Confucian view on punitive campaigns, the good ruler will be welcomed by the people who live under vicious tyrants, because they transform every place they go like the fall of timely rain. For this reason, too, he will prevail in all his military campaigns. The Confucian aim of morally transforming a whole population is an ambitious one, and again, Sun Tzu, the author of The Art of War, is more pragmatic. He wants the army to be like a mindless force that the commander can bend to his strategic will. Thus, Sun Tzu compares the army to children who are not just docile, but will willingly die for the commander as a child would for his parents. These images powerfully recall passages in the Lao Tzu, like the one we quoted a couple of episodes ago. The sage ruler will reduce the people to a state of oblivious contentment, with empty minds and full bellies. The army is also like rushing water that adapts automatically to any terrain. This should sound familiar. The comparison of the army to water sounds very Taoist, especially given that Sun Tzu elaborates on the metaphor by speaking of the commander's strategy as formless or having no constant shape. We might even see a parallel between Daoism and that brutal story about the concubines. What could be more Taoist than the idea of building an army, an organization associated with masculine violence, entirely from women? In The Art of War, Sun Tzu likewise depicts the soldiers as passive playthings in the hands of the commander, effectively infantilized or feminized. The parallels between Sun Tzu and Lao Tzu go beyond thematic resonances, though. The Art of War encourages the use of devious tactics like using ravines, bad weather, darkness, and fog to conceal troop movement. One should also pretend to be weak, for instance by steaming food instead of roasting it over fires, so that from a distance at night, the army will seem smaller than it is. In his opening chapter, Sun Tzu even says that warfare is the Tao of deception. We find an echo of these ideas in the Lao Tzu, when it instructs, govern the state with correctness, but operate the army with surprise tactics. Notice here the implicit separation of political rule from military command, with moral considerations constraining the former, but not the latter. As we know, the Lao Tzu also teaches that one can overcome enemies through weakness rather than strength, which is one possible understanding of the Lao Tzu's complementarity. In this case, the plan to overcome one's opponent is reminiscent of Sun Tzu's recommendation to seem weaker than one is. Or take this piece of advice, which comes from the Lao Tzu, but would feel perfectly natural coming from Sun Tzu. March without formation, stretch one's arm without showing it, confront enemies without seeming to meet them, hold weapons without seeming to have them. Conversely, Sun Tzu could be talking about the Taoist sage instead of his ideal commander when he speaks of being unfathomable. Though we have been using the traditional English title, Art of War, for Sun Tzu's treatise, the original Chinese name for it is Sun Tzu Bing Fa, which may be translated as Sun Tzu on Military Strategy. You may recognize that important word, fa, which we have encountered several times with the meaning measure or standard. In this case, fa might rather be understood as a methodology or a strategy for use in military affairs. If one were to name the core of Sun Tzu's method, it would probably not be deception, despite that line in the first chapter that warfare is the Tao of deception. Rather, the main point is adaptability, or responsiveness to circumstance. You may recall the passage in the Lao Tzu which states that knowing the 5 colors makes one blind, and knowing the 5 tones makes one deaf. Sun Tzu makes an almost identical point. Though we recognize 5 named colors, tones, and flavors, in fact, our experience of these phenomena is indefinitely varied. And so it is in warfare. The good commander's strategy is formless because it shapes itself to each new circumstance. His goal is always to assess the strengths and weaknesses of the enemy and to find every opportunity to gain new advantages for his own side, for instance by seeking to choose the time and place of the battle. Thus, remarks Sun Tzu, one who excels at warfare compels men and is not compelled by other men. Just as important is that the commander must master himself, never acting out of emotion but always out of tactical considerations. It's not enough for him to study the opponent, he must also assess the capacities of his own army and his own self, because one who knows neither the enemy nor himself will invariably be defeated in every engagement. When Sun Tzu writes, "In order, wait the disordered, in tranquility await the clamorous, this is the way to nurture one's strength," we again feel that we could be reading the Lao Tzu. It also has plenty to say about self-mastery and self-knowledge, as in this blunt piece of advice, "He who conquers others has physical strength, he who conquers himself is strong." Of course, that advice doesn't need to apply to warfare. It could apply to personal ethics too, and in fact it probably does, because the next line says that whoever is contented is rich. Still, by now it should be clear why Sun Tzu's ideas might be described as applied Daoism. Knowledge of the self, knowledge of others, knowledge of circumstances, and total flexibility in dealing with whatever opportunities and challenges arise jointly guarantee success to the military commander. While Sun Tzu's embrace of deception and other morally dubious tactics is probably the most famous aspect of his work, it is in fact simply a corollary of this overall approach. Supposedly, during the spring and autumn period, it had been a point of honor deliberately to attack the opposing army at its strongest point. That might be noble, but it isn't going to win you many battles. Sun Tzu's wise commander, by contrast, will discover and exploit every weakness in his enemy and every strength on his own side. And Sun Tzu was not alone in adopting this approach. In the ancient military treatises, we often come across the term shu, meaning the intelligent manipulation of circumstances. Examples of shu could be straightforward, like trying to occupy high ground and attacking when the enemy is tired, but they could also be more subtle, like using psychological tricks to maintain good morale in one's own army and undermine the morale of the opponents. But speaking of good morale, perhaps puts too friendly a spin on the idea. One common piece of advice was to send troops into situations from which there is no escape, so that they must fight to survive rather than retreat. Sun Bin sums up the concept of shu nicely when he writes, "One wanting to unravel a jumbled tangle of silk threads does not tug at it and strike it. If we avoid the enemy's strong points and attack him where he is most vulnerable, and if we change the overall circumstances and control the strategic advantage, the situation will resolve itself." There's evidence that the state of Wu, where Sun Tzu served, really did use this sort of tactics. In their long-running conflict with neighboring states, they were often outnumbered, yet they prevailed by encouraging their enemies to fight amongst themselves and by making quick attacks into enemy territory and then withdrawing, rather than leaving themselves exposed. Such tactics were later used by the Qin, whose rise to become the first empire of China put an end to the political fractures of the Warring States period, though their rule was very brief before the subsequent rise of the Han. The Qin had evidently been reading their Sun Tzu, or maybe, as we will see in the set of episodes to follow, they were good at implementing the advice of the Fa thinkers, also known as the legalists, who discuss strategies for maintaining the ruler's power. An easily underappreciated aspect of Shi tactics is that they would often call for the commander to refrain from action, for instance by not attacking the enemy so long as one is at a disadvantage. Sun Tzu is more cautious still. He thinks that one should only attack when one is virtually assured of victory, because the highest priority is to avoid defeat. If no clear-cut opportunity presents itself, one should simply adopt a defensive position. In Sun Tzu's opinion, the most successful commanders of former times were not those who defied daunting odds to prevail over mighty opponents. They were the ones who found easy targets and picked them off one by one. This may not have won them fame or a reputation for courage, but it did mean that, as Sun Tzu puts it, their victories were free from errors. Here we may detect another resonance with the Lao Tzu, in this case concerning wu wei, or non-action. The commander described in The Art of War is often inactive and passive, avoiding engagement and moving his forces around to prevent them from getting pinned down. His army is like water flowing freely across the land, impossible to trap or contain. Thus, the best military commander would often choose not to fight at all. Prolonged warfare is a sure recipe for disaster, and Sun Tzu is emphatic that this should be avoided at all costs. But even effective lightning strikes, like those practiced historically by the state of Wu, are not the best option of all. It's better to prevail while leaving the enemy's cities and armies intact. After all, once you've won, these will belong to you. So, Sun Tzu recommends undermining the enemy's alliances and plans instead of attacking their cities. A perfect military campaign would be one in which the daunting appearance of the commander's army, which might of course be a misleading one, and subtle work aimed at undermining the opponent's position would convince the enemy to sue for peace without a single drop of blood being shed. This theme in the work has led some interpreters to the rather surprising conclusion that The Art of War is, despite its title, actually a work of pacifism. Not the pacifism that grows out of the consequentialist logic of the Mohists, but a Taoist-like inversion of aristocratic values. Weakness rather than strength, stillness rather than aggression, peace over war. In the Lao Tzu, for instance, we read that he who assists the ruler with Tao does not dominate the world with force. A powerful passage found in its 31st chapter states, "Weapons are instruments of evil, not the instruments of a good ruler. When he uses them unavoidably, he regards calm restraint as the best principle. Even when he is victorious, he does not regard it as praiseworthy, for to praise victory is to delight in the slaughter of men." This sort of outright distaste for violence, though, is hard to square with the more pragmatic attitude of Sun Tzu. He is all for offensive warfare when the moment is right, the right moment being one when you can win easily. If he often recommends against battle, this is simply because such victories are hard to come by. For him, the wise commander has no moral qualms about violence, but knows that there are usually more effective ways to subdue the enemy. As was once observed by that amoral and cynical strategist Henry Kissinger, Western strategists test their maxims by victories in battles, Sun Tzu tests by victories where battles have become unnecessary. Whether it's Sun Tzu's cynicism or coldly calculating strategies for winning, it is perhaps unsurprising that there are many popular renditions of the insights of The Art of War, for business and management applications, for example. Our approach has been rather different, as we've tried to relate The Art of War to Daoism. In doing so, we've already begun to shift our attention away from the Lao Tzu and to consider wider developments associated with Daoism. We'll continue to do so as we turn to a second classical work of Taoist philosophy, the Zhuangzi. Here's how fascinating and compelling this text is. On another podcast devoted to Chinese philosophy, called This is the Way, the hosts Justin Tiwald and Richard Kim adopted a policy of asking interviewed guests to recommend a favorite work from the tradition. But they ran into the problem that everybody kept suggesting the same text, namely the Zhuangzi. And with good reason, as we'll begin to see next time here on our own podcast, The History of Philosophy in China.